Good day. I'm Joseph Noah. I'm a medical doctor and a biochemist, and I'm the author of Document X, Direct Evidence of God's Existence. The subject I want to discuss now is embryology. Now, it is said that the most worthy of admiration is the development of an animal or plant from its embryo. The Quran, which does not omit any fundamental principle, not any important scientific phenomenon, would not have left out something as worthy of admiration, such as the developing embryo. Chapter 23, verse 12, 13, and 14 give us a brief summary of embryonic development of vertebrates, which include humans. It states, "And certainly we have evolved man from an extract of clay, and after changing the state of his condition, placed him as a sperm drop in an abode of stability in the wall of the womb for a predetermined time. Then we fashioned a drop of sperm into a mass of cells attached via a stalk to the early placenta. Then we formed out of it a chewed embryonic mass of cells. Then we formed bones within the lump of flesh, clothed the bones with elongated muscle groups attached to the bone. And then we develop out of it a new creation." Now the first part of the verse speaks about the evolution of man from not clay, but extract of clay. In other words, the minerals or the chemicals within the clay. And this I'm going to discuss more in detail when we have a look at evolution. The next part of the verse states, "And after changing the state of his condition, placed him as a drop of sperm in an abode of stability." These must include all the stages from the constitution of the earth right up till the invention of sex, a defining mark in human evolution, as indicated by the word sperm drop and womb in the verse. Now the next few verses focus entirely on embryological issues. It begins with the sperm drop. Now I inserted the word sperm because in chapter 75:37 the word sperm is clearly associated with sexual fluid. The word sperm drop can also be understood to refer to the fertilized egg for three reasons. In chapter 7:189, it tells us that you require both male and female agencies for conception. And 76 verse 2, it says, "He creates you from a sperm intermingled." Intermingled with what? This is made clear in 86, where it says, "He creates you from a mixture of fluids which issues from between the pelvic arch and the external genitalia." Now the Quran describes here the pelvis as an arch of bones, and the arch is completed by the backbone. Now, the ribs don't form part of this anatomy and must be discarded. Now, the pelvis houses the internal sexual organs, including the internal genitalia, which are the ovaries, and therefore the word genitals in this verse, which is mentioned severally, must therefore refer to the external genitals. Now, since in classical Arabic, the pelvic arch is commonly associated with female anatomy, it is plausible that the external genitalia in this verse refers to the testes which produce the sperm. Combining these verses, the Quran describes the essential ingredients for conception, a mixture of reproductive fluids, which include the ovum and the sperm. Another important verse which is relevant here is chapter 80, verse 19. Which tells us that the fertilized egg contains the plan or program, in other words, the genetic plan, the instructions that will decide the future features of the embryo and determining its species type. It tells us that our humanity is rooted in our genes. Now the fertilized egg divides into two cells, 2 into 4, 4 into 8, until a blastocyst is formed. Now, a blastocyst describes a 7 to 12-day-old embryo, which consists of a compact mass of cells having a cavity. The blastocyst then is embedded in the wall of the womb, described as an abode of stability because the womb is the most secured and safest place for the developing embryo. And here it stays for a predetermined time as stated in the verse, which refers to the gestational period. The blastocyst becoming embedded in the wall of the womb can be deduced from another verse, chapter 2, verse 223, which states, "Your wives bear your progeny like the preparing and planting of the seed." Here, human implantation is compared to the preparation and implantation with the seed. And this is appropriate especially from an embryological point of view. If you want to plant a seed, what you do, you excavate some soil and you place the seed in the hole and cover it with a layer of soil. In the same way, when the blastocyst buries itself in the wall of the womb, it is covered by the inner layer of the womb. The blastocyst then grows out finger-like projections called villi, which penetrate the wall of the womb, which will become the placenta from which the growing embryo derives nourishment. In the same way, the seed grows out rootlets, which penetrate the soil for nourishment of the seed. Now, the connection of the embryo to the early placenta is evident from the fact that it is attached via a stalk, clearly the future umbilical cord. The next verse describes the human embryo as a chewed embryonic mass. Now, I've inserted the word cells in this passage since the Quran describes its essential features in the following verses. In 7:189 it states that He is who originated and evolved you from a single living entity. Now, this is a good description of a cell which marked the beginning of living biology. And in 56:64, it refers to the ability of cells to divide. And in 80 verse 19 tells us that the genetic material is contained within cells. And in 21:30, it makes reference to the fact that water is a major component of all living tissue and hence of cells. The next verse states the following: we develop out of it a chewed-like embryonic mass of cells. Now, why chewed-like mass? At this stage, the embryo is about 1 month old, and most of the body divisions called somites are formed, giving the embryo a segmented appearance. Now, the embryo at this stage resembles a plasticine model with biting teeth marks. This has actually been demonstrated experimentally, where the experimentalist sank his teeth into a clay model, and the result was remarkable, very similar to the early growing embryo. The same word alaqa also means a leech, and the early embryo has a very similar appearance to a leech. And like a leech, it parasitizes and it clings. Now, let us go to the next verse, which states, and then we form bones within the lump of the embryonic mass and clothe the bones with elongated muscle groups attached to the bone. Now, a critic sees an inconsistency here in that according to the literature, muscle is formed first and then bone. If it refers to cardiac muscle or heart muscle, then it's correct because heart muscle is formed well before bone. But he misses a few points. Firstly, there are 3 types of muscle: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, which lines the intestinal organs, and striated muscle. If we examine this verse, the Quran is actually referring to striated muscle because it describes its key features. Striated muscle consists of fibers which are elongated and thin. The muscle wraps around bone like a sleeve fits around an arm, and it's attached to bone. Moreover, the conjunction in this verse is repeated several times to denote sequence. But the Arabic equivalent thumma is a much deeper meaning. It has the meaning of coordination of activities, simultaneous events, and it also conveys the idea of sequence, order, and one stage merging with another stage. So in other words, it accommodates the understanding that different tissues develop at the same time. Now, it was initially incorrectly thought that only once the bony framework is formed of the embryonic limb do adjacent muscle cells migrate inwards and surround the developing bone. Now we know that muscle and bone cells develop more or less concomitantly in the embryonic limb. But why is bone mentioned first? I spoke to Professor Sue Kitson, which is the head of the Department of Cell Biology at the University of Cape Town. And she tells me that there is a special cell staining technique which, if you use it, can distinguish between muscle cells and bone cells. And if you apply this technique to the developing embryonic limb, you find that bone would be detected first, because bone is required to guide muscle to adapt to its organization. In other words, bone patterning dictates muscle patterning. So the Quran is therefore perfectly correct in mentioning bone first, but at the same time employing the conjunction thumma, which gives a more accurate description how embryonic processes unfold. Now the next part of the passage states, and then we develop out of it a new creation. For me, this marks the point of departure, where the human embryo embarks in a new phase of development, becoming distinctly human. Now all these stages described so far, the preceding stages such as the implantation, the placental stage, are shared by all the other embryologies. But this separation or divergence of the human embryo, for me, marks the beginning of the development of the seed of human consciousness. What is interesting is that during this stage of development, there's a particular gene that is switched on that regulates the development of the human brain. Now this gene affects other relevant genes, which influences the brain in many ways. So the result is a surge in growth and differentiation. And this suggests complex neural changes which happen in the human brain, but not in the other embryologies. Another important Arabic word here is that of ansanahu, which means to progress to an elevated state. And this may be a hint at the limitless moral and intellectual potential of the human embryo. Now another verse which gives us important information of the early embryo is in 39 verse 6. This verse states, He creates you in the darkness of the cavities of your mother's womb, one act of creation after the other in 3 layers. Now note the accurate description of the womb. It's an organ having a cavity and it's pitch dark inside it. Then it speaks about 3 layers. Now this refers to the trilaminar stage, where the embryo is about 3 weeks old and consists of 3 layers, 3 germ cell layers, the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. All other tissues develop from these 3 layers. Now this stage is also known as gastrulation. Now gastrulation refers to a complex series of processes of growth and differentiation, and involves the migration and movement of cells so that a structure consisting of 2 cell layers is reorganized into a configuration consisting of 3 layers, which we just mentioned, and this is known as the gastrula. Gastrulation is said to be the most important event in a human's life, and this was stated by a distinguished embryologist. Now, the complexity of gastrulation is conveyed by the phrase, one act of creation after the other act of creation. So the embryo undergoes these various stages, being fashioned, shaped, stretched, bent, bulged into various forms. The Quran therefore describes 5 key stages of embryogenesis: fertilization, implantation, the placental stage, segmentation, and gastrulation. Now we know that the correct sequence of the developing human embryo was only established in the latter half of the 20th century. How a desert dweller in the 7th century could know that the fertilized egg contains the information which would determine the future features of the embryo, and how he could accurately describe the microscopic structures hidden in the darkness of the womb, and how he could correctly lay out the sequence of embryonic development, defy human explanation. As late as the 17th century, even after the invention of the microscope, scientists still held many inaccurate views of reproductive physiology. Once the baby is born, the phases of progress continues. In the light of what has just been said, is it not therefore reasonable that the pattern of development through stages should continue beyond death, but on a higher plane of existence? This is especially so if it's claimed by a being that revealed the deep secrets of embryonic development centuries ago. Now, towards the end of this passage, the Quran speaks about life after death and resurrection. In other words, it's a religious principle being stated here. Now, this is a common theme in the Quran, where it combines a scientific message with a metaphysical statement. It appeals to the atheistic mind, or to the skeptic, to reflect on the many stages that man has gone through, from the constituents of the earth 3.5 billion years ago. Then the Quran takes up the human story from the fertilized egg, and then describes the various embryonic stages. And once the baby is born, the pattern of stages continue. In the light of this, the skeptic is appealed to reflect on the various stages that is passed through, and could not this pattern continue on a higher life beyond death, especially if it comes from a being that revealed the deep secrets of human embryonic development 14 centuries ago. So the Quran doesn't expect us to accept religious doctrines like life after death on the basis of faith alone, but provides us with a logical basis as to why this is possible. And on this basis, the skeptic is appealed to reflect or at least ponder the possibility of a continued existence beyond death.